The morning they came to take her land, Margaret Calloway stood on her porch with a rifle in her hands and a dead man's promise in her heart, and not one soul in the town of Bitter Creek believed she would still be standing there by winter. If you believe in kindness, faith, redemption, and second chances, like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe before we begin, because stories like this one deserve to be carried forward. The winter of 1886 had come down on the Wyoming Territory like the fist of an angry god. Cattle froze standing up in the drifts, their bodies found months later when the thaw finally came, and whole herds that had taken a decade to build vanished under snow that fell for weeks without mercy. Margaret Calloway had lost her husband, Thomas, 3 years before that terrible winter, thrown from a horse on a ridge above their ranch and dead before she could reach him. She had buried him beneath a lone cottonwood tree that overlooked the valley, and she had told herself, kneeling there in the turned earth with her hands raw and her heart hollowed out, that whatever part of her belonged to love and softness had gone into the ground with him. She was 38 years old, and she believed, the way only a grieving woman can believe something false with her whole soul, that this was simply the shape her life would take from then on. Work. Survival. Silence. She ran the ranch alone through that brutal winter and the two after it, rising before dawn to break the ice on the water troughs, riding out in weather that would have killed a lesser wolf, burying what cattle she lost with her own 2 hands because she would not ask the town for pity. The town of Bitter Creek watched her with a strange mixture of respect and suspicion, the way small towns often regard a woman who refuses to bend. She sold what beef she could, mended her own fences, and kept the mortgage payments current on land that had been in Thomas's family since before the territory had a name worth putting on a map. She told herself she was surviving. She did not yet understand that surviving and living were 2 very different things, and that a person could do the first for years without ever managing the second. It was the spring after that third hard winter when a young man named Noah Sutter rode up the long dirt lane to her ranch house, his horse thin from a hard journey, his hat pulled low against the wind, and his manner polite in a way that told her he had been raised right, wherever he had come from. He asked for work. He said he had heard, 3 towns back, that the widow Calloway needed hands for calving season, and that he could ride, rope, and mend fence better than most men twice his size. He was 22 years old, with sun-browned skin and eyes the color of creek water in shadow, and Margaret looked at him standing there holding his hat against his chest, and felt something she had no name for and did not want. She hired him because she needed the help and because there was an honesty in his face that she had learned, through hard years, to trust more than fine words. He proved himself within the first week, pulling a breech calf from a dying heifer in the middle of a cold rain, working until his hands bled and never once complaining. He slept in the bunkhouse, ate at her table, and in the evenings, when the work was done, he would sit on the porch step below her and talk about small things, the weather, the herd, a hawk he had watched circle the ridge that afternoon, and Margaret found herself listening for the sound of his boots on the steps the way a woman listens for something she has convinced herself she no longer wants to hear. The seasons turned, as seasons do, indifferent to the quiet things happening inside 2 human hearts. There were nights in the barn during calving when they worked side by side until the small hours, exhausted and streaked with mud and blood and new life, and there was something in those hours, something honest and stripped of pretense, that no parlor courtship could have built half so strong. There were mornings when Noah had coffee ready before she woke, 2 cups poured before the sun cleared the ridge, and he would hand her one without a word, as though it were the most natural thing in the world for a young hired hand to know exactly how his widowed employer liked her coffee. There were evenings when the work allowed it, and they would walk the west fence line together as the sky burned orange and pink behind the mountains, saying little, needing to say little, because some understandings do not require words to be true. Margaret fought it as long as she could. She told herself it was foolishness, that a woman her age with gray already threading through her dark hair had no business feeling her pulse quicken at the sight of a young man's smile. One evening, when the walk along the fence had stretched longer than either of them intended and the stars had come out hard and bright over the valley, she finally said it aloud, the thing she had been telling herself in the dark for months. "You're too young for a widow my age, Noah. You ought to be courting some girl from town, someone who can give you children and years you won't have to spend watching me grow old before you." He did not argue with her the way she expected. He simply looked at her with those quiet creek water eyes and said that to him, she was perfect, and that he had never once, in all his hard traveling years, found a place or a person that felt like home until he rode up her lane that spring morning. He said a person did not get to choose who they loved any more than they chose the weather, and that he had stopped trying to talk himself out of it weeks ago. Margaret stood there in the cold mountain air with her breath catching in her chest, and for the first time since she had knelt at Thomas's grave, she let herself feel something that was not grief. Word travels fast in a small territory town, and word of the widow Calloway and her young hired hand traveled faster than most. It was not long before the talk reached the ears of Silas Hargrove, the wealthiest rancher in the valley, a man who had spent years trying to buy up the smaller spreads around Bitter Creek to expand his own holdings, and who had set his eye on Margaret's land in particular for the water rights that ran through it. Hargrove had made her an offer once before, in the hard months after Thomas's death, and she had refused him flatly, unwilling to let go of the land her husband had loved. He had not forgotten that refusal, and he was not a man accustomed to being told no. Hargrove began quietly at first, the way powerful men often do when they mean to do real damage. He mentioned to the banker in town, over drinks and idle conversation, that the widow Calloway's mortgage note was coming due sooner than folks realized, and that a woman alone with a young man half her age under her roof was hardly the picture of respectability a bank ought to be extending credit to. He let the gossip do the rest, dropping suggestions into conversations at the general store and the church social, always phrased as concern, never as accusation, until the whole town of Bitter Creek was murmuring about the widow and her cowboy, about impropriety, about a woman who had forgotten her place and her grief far too quickly. Margaret felt the change in the town's eyes when she rode in for supplies, the way conversations stopped when she entered a room, the way women who had once nodded to her politely now looked away. It cut deeper than she let herself admit, because she had spent 3 years proving to that town that she could survive without their help, and now they were ready to believe the worst of her for the crime of finally allowing herself a little happiness. The mortgage note came due at the worst possible moment, in the middle of a summer that had brought drought instead of the rain the herd needed, and Margaret found herself short of the payment by a sum that might as well have been a fortune. She rode into town to speak with the banker, a nervous man named Elias Whitfield who would not quite meet her eyes, and he told her, with obvious discomfort, that the bank could not extend her the grace period she had always been given in years past. He would not say Hargrove's name, but Margaret understood well enough whose hand was behind the sudden change in policy. She rode home that evening with her jaw set and her heart cold with the old, familiar fear of losing everything Thomas had built, and it was there, at the kitchen table with the lamp burning low, that Noah found her with the mortgage papers spread before her and tears she refused to let fall standing bright in her eyes. He did not offer empty comfort. He sat down across from her, took her hands in his rough, scarred ones, and told her plainly that he intended to help her fight for the ranch, not because he pitied her, but because he loved her and because the land was worth fighting for, and so was she. Margaret, frightened and proud in equal measure, told him this was not his burden to carry, that he was young and free and did not need to tie himself to a struggling widow's failing ranch and a town's cruel gossip. It was then that Noah said the words that would stay with her the rest of her life, that protecting someone by pushing them away was not the same as trusting them to stand beside you, and that he had not ridden up her lane looking for an easy life, he had ridden up looking for a true one, and he had found it in her. Together they worked through that summer with a desperation born of love as much as necessity. Noah rode to the neighboring ranches, small outfits like Margaret's own, and found that Hargrove's greed had made enemies of nearly every small rancher in the valley, men and women who had watched him squeeze and threaten and buy his way toward controlling the water and the land for a decade. What Hargrove had not counted on was that fear, pushed far enough, turns into courage, and that a community of proud, hard people does not take kindly to being bullied by one man's ambition forever. Noah and Margaret gathered a handful of these ranchers together, quietly, and proposed something that had never been tried in Bitter Creek before, a cooperative arrangement to share water rights and grazing land fairly among the small outfits, strong enough together to resist any single man's attempt to starve them out one by one. It was Sheriff Amos Reeves, a fair-minded lawman who had watched Hargrove's dealings with growing unease for years, who finally brought the matter into the open. When Hargrove tried one final push, pressuring the bank to foreclose on Margaret's note before the harvest could bring in the money to cover it, Sheriff Reeves stood in the town square before half of Bitter Creek and read aloud the terms of the original mortgage, proving that Hargrove had improperly influenced the bank's decision through threats to Whitfield's own position, a fact the frightened banker finally found the courage to confirm publicly. His voice shaking but his resolve, at last, unbroken. The town that had once whispered about the widow and her young cowboy now saw the truth of what had been happening in their midst, and the same gossip that had once been turned against Margaret turned instead, swift and righteous, against Silas Hargrove. He left the valley within the month, his reputation ruined and his ambitions with it, and the small ranchers of Bitter Creek kept their land, their water, and their independence. Margaret Calloway married Noah Sutter that autumn beneath the same cottonwood tree where she had buried Thomas 3 years before, and she did so with a peace in her heart that surprised her more than anything else that difficult year had brought. She understood, standing there with her hand in Noah's and the whole valley gold and red with the turning season around them, that loving again did not erase what she had lost, and that grief and joy could live side by side in the same heart without either one betraying the other. Age had never truly been the question standing between them. The real question, the one that mattered, was whether two people were willing to choose each other honestly, fight for each other honestly, and build something true together despite what a frightened world might whisper about them. Margaret and Noah answered that question every single day for the rest of their lives, through good seasons and hard ones, through a ranch that grew and prospered under their combined hands, and through a partnership built not on youth or age but on the kind of trust that only survives real testing. Before we close this story, I want to ask you something. Wherever you are watching this from tonight, take a moment and tell me in the comments where you are joining us from, and what lesson this story left with you. Was it about the courage to love again after loss? The difference between protecting someone and trusting them? The quiet strength it takes to stand your ground against those who would take what is yours. I would love to know which part of Margaret and Noah's story touched you most. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that it is never too late for kindness, for faith, for a second chance you never thought you would be given, then please like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe for more stories like this one. Margaret Calloway once believed her life as a woman had ended the day she buried her husband beneath that cottonwood tree. She was wrong. Sometimes the second chance does not announce itself with fanfare or fortune. Sometimes it simply rides up the lane on a tired horse, hat in hand, asking for nothing more than the chance to prove itself true. And sometimes, if we are brave enough to let it in, that is exactly what it does.